Hi there, this is Power in Politics. I'm David Cochrane in Ottawa. With 6 days until the election, we finally have platforms from all the major parties. Today, the Conservatives released their plan, promising tax cuts and new spending.
A Conservative government understands that a dollar left in the hands of the person who earned it is always better spent than a dollar in the hands of the politician who taxed it.
But to no one's surprise, the other main party leaders aren't buying it.
These numbers are a joke.
The Conservative math is not mathing.
It's very easy to say, vote with us. There will be less taxes.
A record number of Canadians have already cast their vote, and polls continue to suggest a Liberal victory. Will these platforms change anything? It's day 31 of the election campaign, and Power in Politics starts right now. We begin in the Greater Toronto area, where Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre is making a final push for those critical Ontario votes. This morning, with just 6 days to go before Election Day, Poilievre released his party's platform while in Woodbridge. And next hour, he's expected to hold a rally in Vaughan.
The choice is this: a fourth Liberal term with Mark Carney, whose reckless Liberal plan will add even more debt than Trudeau, or a new Conservative government with a responsible plan to save $125 billion and put us back on the path to growth and security.
Poilievre is promising billions of dollars in tax cuts and billions in new spending, while also slashing the deficit by 70%. So, how will he pay for it? The CBC's Kate McKenna is following the Conservative campaign. Kate.
David, the Conservatives are doing something a little unusual here, and that is that they've included projected revenue growth inside their costed platform, meaning that they are arguing essentially that the policies that they're going to implement will cause an economic boom, and for that reason, projected revenue growth will lead to their ability to shrink the deficit and pay for programs. Now, it's hard to do an apples-to-apples analysis with the Liberal platform because the Conservatives are the only ones who are doing it this way. Now, it is worth noting that other party leaders have essentially accused the Conservatives of fake math, but the campaign is defending what they did, saying that so many of their programs are intended to increase revenues into the federal coffers that it only makes sense to do it this way. They say that their program has been reviewed by 2 experts, as well as the parliamentary budget officer in some cases. David?
All right, Kate, thanks very much. That's the CBC's Kate McKenna in Mississauga, Ontario. Now, Poilievre is also planning cuts to be able to afford his plan. First, he intends to defund the CBC, something he has long promised. He's also promised increasing cuts to government consultants, saving up to $10 billion. And he would end what he calls foreign aid to, quote, dictators, terrorists, and global bureaucracy by up to $3 billion. It's not clear who exactly that would affect. Now, we did request a spokesperson or a candidate from the Conservative Party to talk about their platform, but nobody was made available. Now, the Liberals and the NDP unveiled their plans over the weekend.
Canadians have been pinching their pennies long enough. It's time for government to start pinching pennies as well.
The Conservative math is not mathing. No. If you look at what they're proposing, the numbers are not based in any reality.
These numbers are a joke. We aren't in a joke. We are in the worst crisis of our lives.
I believe that they want to cut so much that I thought at first is, Elon Musk, please get away.
All right, the Power Panel is here to talk about all of the party platforms now that they're out, with a focus on the Conservatives, because that's the newest. We've got Emily Nicolas, who's a columnist for Le Devoir. Françoise Boivin is a former NDP MP. And here with me in the studio, Michelle Cadario is a former Liberal National Campaign Director. And Kate Harrison is a Conservative political analyst. Happy Tuesday, last Tuesday of the election. It's good to see you all. Kate, I'd like to start with you. The deficit numbers in the Conservative plan are much lower than the deficit numbers in the Liberal plan. But there's a difference in how they do this, in that the Liberals booked no revenue from economic investments they're making. The Conservatives book revenue from economic investments that they're making. You heard the criticism there from Mark Carney. What's your sense of where things stand now that the platforms are out?
Yeah, well, there are certainly a lot of contrasts to be seen on that deficit number, 70% reduction for the Conservatives compared to Carney and the Liberals platform. I'd also point out, I heard the Bloc leader talking there about cuts. It's $14 billion per year. Over 5 years, that'll be about $70 billion. When you consider that the operating budget of the Government of Canada is about $558 billion, $14 billion is far from draconian. So this is not massive cuts. I think it's pragmatic and realistic in order to find some efficiencies within the government. In terms of looking at future revenues, to me, this is betting big on Canada's resource economy. The absence of that from the from the Carney platform, perhaps authored by the Trudeau team, but from the Carney platform, I think speaks to where they may sit on resource development and how much they plan or don't plan to actually move those natural resources. So, independent economists have said that this is actually reachable and might even present an underestimate of what is possible in terms of the potential of extrapolating resources. So I think it's fair to consider that in calculations and assign that you can grow and reduce spending at the same time.
Yeah, Philip Cross, former chief economist at StatsCan, Tim Sargent, former associate deputy minister at finance, are the experts that have validated the Conservative platform. But, Michelle, I've seen some people say that essentially this counts on the rate of GDP growth doubling. Well, and there's some pretty big revenue numbers there.
It's for the very reason that we have never in Canada done this kind of math before when doing our projections. It's because the bond markets don't buy it, and it's because our credit lenders don't buy it either, because it's hocus pocus. And we're talking, this platform is based on this idea that we're going to have this incredible growth at a time when the world is on the precipice of a recession, and Donald Trump is like making the markets crash every second day. And so the suggestion that somehow we are going to buck the trend and that you're going to be able to book all of these fantasy numbers into your planning document, it just doesn't even make sense. And so it's original, and I'll give them points for originality. But let's not forget, yes, there is a lot spent by governments in a year, but of that, 60% goes to healthcare and to transfers to the provinces. And so that brings the actual number down quite a bit in terms of what we actually have per year. And these Doge-style cuts, I think that, I don't often quote Yves Blanchette, but he had it right. It's a very kind of, a third of our spending in terms of foreign aid. Well, that sure sounds like Trump. Getting rid of woke policies, I'm not even sure what that means, but again, that was something that they're kind of going after.
Well, it's interesting. The woke ideology thing is in the Quebec platform released in French, but it's not in the English platform. I don't know if that's a change or if and it's not even in the Quebec section. They do talk about a free speech policy, mostly for the protection of Jewish students on campus, but the woke ideology thing that was in the Quebec platform released in Quebec City is not in the English one.
It'd probably be a question a lot of people want asked of Pierre Poilievre if he took any questions.
All right. Kate, I will come back. Françoise, what are your thoughts here? Like some of the revenue projections, I know they're betting big on the oil and gas sector, but they think if they, revenue from repealing C-69, like they think is going to be like $250 million right out of the gate. Revenue gain from repealing the electric vehicle mandates, delivering $5 billion by 2028. We never had a technical briefing or a proper explanation as to how that works from the party. I mean, what's your sense of the revenue they're anticipating from getting rid of policies and cutting programs?
Well, as much as I love to play poker, I am not a betting woman on politics, and that for me, actually all platforms I find are what we call in French des vœux pieux. It's like pious wishes that the parties wants to achieve. So many things depend on what's going to happen. A whole bunch of the Conservative platform depends on construction, on new housing, on making municipalities do certain things, and they are not the boss of the municipalities. So it's easy to write on paper. It's not maybe as easy to get the ball rolling. So there's a lot of things that depends on so many factors. The Trump factor is definitely one. But I think the bottom line for people, they will not do those analyses that we are doing line by line. They will see a different type of policy. Pierre Poilievre took a lot of time this morning to explain that yes, there will be deficit, but imagine the lowest deficit of the Liberal is still bigger than the biggest one from the Conservatives. So it's like
by billions.
For certain people will say, who cares? Because in this day and age, with what we're living right now, we're not looking at those numbers. For other people, they'll say it counts, it matters, because we don't want to worsen our situation. So again, it goes back to who you trust that will be the closest. Is Mark Carney making a Paul Martin of himself, blowing a bit the numbers? So at the end of the year, he'll come with a lower one and we'll say, wow, exceptional administration. I do not know. So a lot of these numbers for me are wishful thinking, and they might add up for certain people. But for me, there's still too many question marks in our foreseeable future.
Yeah, no, I hear you on that. But I would point out that there is no booking of revenue in the Liberal platform the way there is in the Conservative. So we're going to, in a minute, Kevin Page is going to join us and just walk us through his assessment of it, because I am no expert. Kevin Page is, though. Emily, your thoughts on this landing this late in the campaign and the kind of messages it sends to voters who are out there still?
To be honest, David, I'm having a two solitude kind of day because today is Earth Day. So with the same exact platform release on the French side of things, we've been insisting a lot on just the carbon emission of the plans and thinking about that as well as the numbers. And so what is really stark as a contrast when you look at the Conservative and the Liberal platform is in terms of how you spend, you plan to have more revenues for the Canadian state. How much of that is at the expense of the environment, and how much of that is about increasing and or reducing CO2 emission. And part of me wished that my English brain and my French brain were working at the same time, which is that we were able to have the numbers in terms of the economy, revenues for the state, spending, and also consider a deficit in CO2 when it is there. And it's very clear in the Conservative platform that it would mean a slight increase of our CO2 emission and that the Liberal platform aims at reducing it. And I think we need to stop segregating those conversations when we're having economic conversations about the plans of the different political parties, especially on April 22nd of all day of the year. That being said, I do think that it's a debate of basically political philosophy, including because of what I just outlined. The Conservatives believe that it is about cutting the size of the state and having fewer taxes, and that in and of itself is good policy. And the Liberals believe that you need to have a balance between some tax cut and that government spending has a role in crises. And the NDP believes that the government has even more of a role in crises. And so everybody is acting according to the ideologies. The math might not be always mathing, but at least in terms of their intention, it's very much coming from a sense of basically political philosophy for once. We've had campaigns in the past when the Liberals campaigned to the left of the NDP and vice versa. This is not one of those times. At least political parties are behaving according to their values.
Okay, I got you there. We've got to put a pause on this because I do want to bring in Kevin Page, because the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy at the University of Ottawa has crunched the numbers on the party platforms, and their president and CEO, Kevin Page, joins me now to talk about what he found. And Kevin, of course, is a former parliamentary budget officer. So Kevin Page, it's good to see you. Thanks for doing this. And I know you're rushing to get these out the door, so we appreciate you being here, sir.
Good to be with you, David.
All right, so let's start with the Conservative platform, because it's the one that is the hottest off the press. They assume that their policies will increase economic activity and create more than $50 billion in new tax revenue. I mean, was it reasonable for them to include that in their math based on what you've looked at?
No. No, it's pretty much a traditional practice, David, in the financial community, to be aware of what the potential, positive economic impacts could be from, putting in measures, but actually to have them hit a bottom line is sort of to take credit and plan based on, create a lower deficit track. That isn't, it's not a good budgeting practice. So I would say that is a mistake, on the Conservative part.
Okay, so let's go through this because I've just been handed sort of the IFSD fiscal credibility assessment. For the Conservatives, and we'll go through the Liberals right after this because they're the two main contenders for power here, you give them an overall assessment of a pass. Principle 1, realistic and credible economic and fiscal assumptions, pass. Responsible fiscal management, pass. And transparency, good. When I was in school, a pass was pretty good for me. I mean, what should we take from this that it is a pass as opposed to a higher overall assessment? What does that tell us?
Well, I think if in general, I'd say that there's a lot of good things that were done in all the platforms, including the Liberals and the NDP and the Conservatives. And in terms of assumptions, it's clear we know what their planning base is. Mm-hmm. We know that they're working from the parliamentary budget officers sort of pre-election, pre-tariff impact baseline, so we can work from that. They're articulating challenges, economic and fiscal challenges. And they're highlighting risks with respect to the United States. So we score those. I think it's clear to us, like in this environment, I think it's clear to the electorate that we're dealing with a major crisis, and that's going to create creating enormous economic instability. And I think why the Conservatives get a pass and not a higher rating, a good rating, is that. We don't think they properly take into account the additional risk from the instability that we're starting to experience already, and it's really going to get worse. So, I mean, that's why they get a pass.
Okay, so when we look at the revenue, though, that they've put in there, because it's difficult to do a straight apples-to-apples comparison with the Liberal platform, which, again, we'll get to because they don't book the revenue. When you look at revenue gain from additional homes built, revenue gain from capital gains measures, revenue gain from repealing C-69, clean electric regulations, these things, are those numbers credible or not credible, or is it just their inclusion that you sort of quibble with because it's not standard practice? How should we interpret the critique of that?
I think that there's two issues, David. One is, first, from a transparency perspective, it's fine to see what a party thinks could be the additional economic impact from a certain measure, a deregulation measure, a red tape measure. This is what we think the impact could be on GDP. We don't have a problem with that. I think, again, as I noted, to actually book that, so to speak, so you show a lower deficit track, we do have a problem with that. It's not a standard practice. It hasn't been in Canada for many decades, including past Conservative governments, including Mr. Harper's government. I think there's a major credibility problem with respect to those estimates. You go back to past budgets. I've seen you in these lockups, David. You look at those rules of thumb. 1 percentage point of real GDP growth probably gives you, a positive impact on the deficit on the bottom line of about $5-6 billion. So to actually generate $60 billion in additional revenues from deregulation, from the cutting of red tape over 4 years, that is an excessively high number. And then overlaying that, you're letting it go to the bottom line. So we have a problem with that.
Okay, last question on that. So when we look at the deficit numbers that the Conservatives are projecting, it adds up to about $130 billion, or no, that's the Liberals. Sorry. Even with a combined $131 billion from savings and new revenues, the Conservative platform is projecting a total deficit of about $100 billion over the next 4 years. So how should we judge those numbers? And then I'll move on to what the Liberals have put on the table.
Well, I think we judge those numbers by looking at what's behind them in terms of the assumption that we just talked about, the credibility issue with respect to booking those estimates. There's in addition, other parties also have issues there, where other party platforms are booking what we call efficiency savings. We see over time, and I've been around for many decades, including program review years. We often put out numbers, and we see there's a lot of slippage. And we can look at the Conservative platform. Where are they seeing program efficiencies? They're thinking they're going to find $10 billion for the saving 4 years out just on consulting, and like the total number for that number for professional services is about $20 billion. Actually, the management consulting part is quite a bit smaller than that. So I don't think it's possible to wipe all of it out. A lot of those professional services are security services, they're accounting services, they're engineering services. So again, we look at that number. I mean, it's good that from a transparency perspective, the fact that they actually highlight a number, we could see where that is helpful. On the program cuts point of view, sometimes we do see slippages in those numbers, but they are transparent on that. We know there are significant cuts to foreign aid as an example. They're being transparent. We know that they plan to reduce the size of the workforce. We can look at those numbers. Sometimes you do get slippage, but they are being transparent. I think in terms of the amount of deficit, here we are, David. We're probably headed into a recession.
Yeah.
And we're having one of our major political parties says they can actually reduce the deficit as we head into a period of significant economic weakness. Now the government spends about $500 billion a year. We're a little over a $3 trillion economy. It's typical. You want governments to actually help stabilize the economy as we go through this instability. Instead, we have a plan actually that tries to reduce the deficit, both relative to the baseline and from an annual, like a year-to-year adjustment. So there's a fiscal stance problem that I think some economists will have to actually, is this the time to try to reduce the deficit, particularly in 2025-26?
Okay. I want to get into the Liberals quickly now, because you've given them an overall assessment of good on all the three principles: realistic and credible economic and fiscal assumptions, good; responsible fiscal management, good; transparency, good. Now, responsible fiscal management, they've got the deficits that are tens of billions of dollars higher than the Conservatives. You give them a pass. So why is a higher deficit platform good and a lower deficit platform only a pass? Explain that gap if you can.
So, in terms of like the deficit tracks in both the Conservatives and Liberals, if you look at the numbers, if you deflate them by the size of the economy, in the Liberal, the Conservative track, which we have some issues with, if you include those assumptions with respect to positive revenue gains, they have the deficit kind of at 1% this year, falling to 0.4% 4 years out. The Liberals have the deficit at 2% this year as a percentage of GDP, falling to about 1.4%. So a higher deficit track in a smaller platform. I think from the point of view where the economy at, the size of the amount of weakness we see in the economy, it's not unusual to see the deficit get a little bit bigger in a period of weakness.
Right.
We saw the 2008 financial crisis. We saw it during COVID. So I think, there's not that much different as a percentage of GDP, 1% to 0.5%, 2% to 1.4%. It's not an enormous difference that I think bond rating agencies are going to focus on.
But the big difference, Kevin, I guess, in the way the two platforms are presented goes back to where I started this. There is no revenue baked into the fiscal track for the Liberals versus what the Conservatives have done. So Mr. Carney said today that if he had prepared his platform the same way the Conservatives prepared their platform, he'd be showing a surplus by year 4. Is that an accurate and fair statement?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if that's true. I don't know that that's true. We didn't look at those sorts of numbers. Some credit to the Liberals. They did have an annex in their platform that did show the multipliers under different situations. Multipliers are like these positive economic benefits. If you spend $1 for capital investment, what might the return be? These returns, could be different depending on how weak or strong the economy is. So they present it, but they make a point, say we don't actually have prudence in this platform, but they do expect to see some positive economic gains from those, additional capital investment, which they are not showing. In fact, they're not even highlighting even as prudence, but they do make mention of it.
Okay, so just one last question, Kevin, before I let you go. So basically, if you stripped the revenue out of the Conservative platform and did it the same the Liberals did, or do revenue in the Liberal platform and the same methodology the Conservatives did, the deficit numbers are actually a whole lot closer together than the gap on first reading because of the different ways of preparation.
Correct.
Am I correct there?
Yeah, correct.
Okay.
And I think it's probably fair to say we have under Mr. Carney, Prime Minister Carney, the Liberal platform, somewhat of a hard target. They're saying they're going to balance the operating budget, in 2028-29. So it's a hard target that Parliament could hold the Liberals to account. I actually think they'll have a hard time meeting that target. I think the Conservatives, they don't actually have a hard target. They have kind of a fiscal rule saying if we're going to have additional spending, we're going to offset it. And if we're going to raise taxes, we're going to have a referendum. But they don't actually have a hard target, though the Conservatives are showing a much lower deficit track, as you've noted. And that would be consistent with a declining debt to GDP ratio, which is a good practice.
Okay. Kevin Page, we appreciate you. It's a lot of numbers. I think I got the gist of it, though. Thank you very much. That's Kevin Page, former parliamentary budget officer, now with the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, David.
Okay, we're going to pick up that conversation with the panel there. So, Kate, done the same way, the deficit numbers are probably a whole lot closer. A higher grade from Kevin Page and his team for the Carney platform than the Poilievre platform.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Well, something that Mr. Page just said that I took note of was that it's a good practice to look at the declining debt to GDP ratio. That was the fiscal anchor for the Liberals for many years, including when Chrystia Freeland was finance minister. Pardon me, over the weekend.
That seems so long ago, doesn't it?
It seems so long ago. But, and so too does the fiscal anchor, because the Carney platform really does diminish that. It has an increase in the debt to GDP ratio in addition to $130 billion in new spending. So, none of us are economists. I think different economists will have different views on this and all of the plans, but I think we are ultimately talking about an ideological difference between whether or not now is the time to spend, and I would say spend perhaps recklessly, or if we can bet big on the resource economy and try to generate some real economic growth, not just look to spend our way out of a crisis.
Michelle?
Well, I would say that, I'm not sure that the workers in the steel industry, in the auto industry, pulp and paper, pharmaceuticals, if tariffs come out against that, are thinking that spending on them and trying to preserve their industries while Donald Trump is going after them is reckless spending in any way.
Well, protection for those workers is still included in the Conservative plan.
The Conservatives have $125 million put towards that. Their tax cut, which is supposed to be apparently the $20 billion that they're booking from tariffs, there's only like $1.5 billion of that even spent in the first year. They've back-ended everything. So they're not even sending that money back. What the Liberals have said very clearly, and Mr. Carney's been very clear about, is any money that comes in for tariffs is going to go back to support those workers and those industries.
The Conservatives have the same commitment.
No, they don't.
Yes, they do. The
No,
Conservatives have said that any money that is generated from the tariffs will go to impacted workers.
Well, there is a slight difference, because it is all the money goes to aid, but the Liberals have said all of it will go to targeted aid of specific sectors. Pierre Poilievre has said targeted aid to specific sectors, but also tax cuts to offset the strain other people will face.
Heaven forbid we let workers
keep
more of their own money.
I'm not criticizing it. I am just saying this is what he said.
You have to have a job to be able to take advantage of a tax cut.
But there will be people who don't lose their jobs who will suffer from higher costs. And this is the Conservative argument.
But that's like $125 million that they've even put in there. And they've back-ended all of their tax cuts. So that $20 billion coming in from tariffs is somehow kind of reactivated on this hypothetical idea that we're going to have all of these projects somehow built that aren't even in existence right now, and somehow they're going to be generating revenue over the next 4 years. Like, they're not even contemplated. It makes no sense whatsoever.
I don't know that that's true, because there are automatic approvals that the Conservatives have talked about for key energy projects in order to proceed. And that has represented lost revenue, I would say, for the Canadian economy because those projects haven't advanced.
Okay.
Well, there's many reasons.
No, sorry. I just want to get the other two in here. So, Françoise, your thoughts on what we heard from Kevin Page on the two front-runner panels, front-runner platforms, excuse me.
It was actually fascinating to see the Conservatives and the Liberals just going at it like they usually do.
That's this election, pretty much, but yeah.
But you know what? It's pretty much what I was hearing when I went to the voting lines during the weekend. And you've got the people who say, and it's what I was trying to say, maybe not in good English before we heard Kevin Page, but it is for the electorate a question of what type of government do you want? Do you want a government that, what I heard mostly this morning is cut this, cut that, do this, do that, proud about lowering, which I think is all great, but this is not what we're facing. And that's what the answer on the other side always says. I want to feel that there's somebody there, not spending like a drunken sailor, but somebody who's willing and can count and help out in those time of needs, because some economies economists are saying it's going to be the worst days we've seen since the crash in 1930 in the 1930s. So we have to have people that just don't show pride because the deficit like I was saying, is I find politicians most of the time are 5 steps behind what is happening. It was popular to say lower the deficit, bring back a balanced budget very soon. We're not in that time no more. So by Kevin Page explaining, I think he made a good explanation about the intros of the revenues. And I'm always worried when people say, we'll get revenues from this and that will amount to that. And I'll get revenue for this and it's like a lot of wishful thinking again. So I want to know what they're willing to spend. And if we make more money, do some adjustment and we'll see. So will that have an impact on the voters? It's just going to go down to the policy they want to see at the helm.
You know, Emily, just tactically, I'm surprised that the party that was calling for an election for 2 years waited until like 5-6 days left to go to bring out their platform. And at this point, you do have Kevin Page saying there's a credibility gap, I believe was the phrase he used in some of the revenue assessments. That surprises me at this stage. I don't know if that just matters to me because I host a daily political show. I mean, what are your thoughts on what we heard from Kevin Page?
No, I think it's an interesting point that you're making. Sorry, we're seeing in the polls in the last couple of days since the debates that the margin of the gap between the Conservative and the Liberals has been shrinking at the tiniest bit. But when you're starting, you reach after the long weekend, the last week of the campaign, with a platform that's being scrutinized in a way that doesn't necessarily hold to the light that well. It's not a good way to start your last stretch of the campaign if that was your last Hail Mary. I just want to say, though, that in terms of the ideological debates, because I very much think that's perhaps the only thing we'll all agree on here, that this is very much an ideological debate. I wish there was also more space when we talk about, investment, returns on investments, and the ways in which it carries. For example, if we take the program of daycare in Canada, the ways in which it helps women benefit the economy. If that isn't in people's calculation, and you just see it as money in, money out, or return of investments that's being calculated, but not being calculated in terms of who benefits from economic growth in Canada, then you might end up having political party platforms that looks good in terms of the numbers adding up, but you're not taking into consideration who actually benefits from this wealth. And this is why all over the Western world, including most, perhaps starkly in the United States, you have countries that are incredibly rich when you have pockets of people who don't see the light of that wealth ever. And so really making sure that the ways in which we scrutinize our platforms, the way we look at what is spending, what is an investment, we also look at who benefits from that investment. Is it mostly male-dominated jobs, or is it also gender balance? Is it looking at regional differences across the country, or is it mostly about the West or about Ontario? These are things we need to be looking at when you scrutinize the political platforms as well.
Okay, Kate, I want to answer one more question about the Conservative platform. I don't know if you're going to know the answer, so it's okay if you don't. It goes back to the point Michelle was making about the tax cut, the cut to the lowest personal income tax rate being backloaded. When they announced that very early in the campaign, they gave us a backgrounder that had $7 billion in tax cuts in year 1 and year 2, and then $14 billion in the final years. Now it's like year 4 before you even get close to that, and you never see that $7 billion number. So the rollout, the phasing, and the costing of it, it's completely different in the platform than it was on the first day of the campaign when the dueling tax cuts was the narrative. Any sense why?
I don't have particular insight on that number. The only thing I would just perhaps speculate is that perhaps the current uncertainty of the economic environment has resulted in them pushing that a little bit farther out.
Okay. All right. Well, look, if anyone in the war room has that answer, because I know you watch, please send it to me. All right. We're just going to switch gears here to the Liberal campaign and the Bloc campaign, because Liberal leader Marc Carney is focusing his efforts on Quebec today. This morning, he visited a manufacturing plant in Trois-Rivières and repeated his closing argument that he should be the one to take on U.S. President Donald Trump. Afterwards, Carney made a couple of whistle stops to visit small businesses. And next hour, He is expected to hold a rally in Laval. At his first stop, Carney took aim at the Conservative Party's platform and the economic assumptions that it makes.
There's a phantom growth that comes from the sky in his platform that arrives and changes his numbers, even though he doesn't have a plan to fight against President Trump. We are in a crisis. And in a crisis, you always plan for the worst. You don't hope for the best. And so you don't make those types of assumptions.
Carney also faced questions about his own platform released just a few days ago. The CBC's Ashley Burke is following the Liberal campaign. Ashley.
David, the Liberal campaign is in battleground Quebec today, targeting a series of ridings with tight races the party wants to win. Leader Mark Carney visited this manufacturer in Trois-Rivières, impacted by U.S. tariffs, and laid out his plan to protect Quebec's interests if he's the one negotiating with Donald Trump, then criticized the Conservatives' platform, calling the numbers a joke, saying it's filled with phantom figures and isn't what's needed to take on this crisis with the U.S. But Carney also faced questions about his own platform that he released over the long weekend, including if it's responsible to run a much bigger deficit than what the Conservatives are pitching. Carney defended his plan that he says is focused on major investments over the next 4 years to grow the economy. David?
Okay, Ashley, thank you very much. That's the CBC's Ashley Burke in Trois-Rivières, Quebec. Well, Bloc Québécois leader Yves-François Blanchet is making as many stops as possible as he crisscrosses the province of Quebec. Blanchet is campaigning today along the St. Lawrence River, speaking mostly about the environment. Tonight, he'll settle in Montreal, where he's recording a French podcast interview at Le Journal de Montréal.
You know, it's like a boxing match. You go in your corner, you sit 30 seconds, and then you go back out there and you fight 3 minutes, and then you go in your corner and you sit 30 seconds, and you do that as long as you can, getting as much support as you can with the clarity and the sincerity and the relevancy of your proposals.
The CBC poll tracker shows Blanchet recovered somewhat in Quebec following the French language debate and his interview on Tout le monde en parle. The CBC's Rafi Boudjikanian is following the Bloc campaign. Rafi.
David, I'm in Yamachiche, Quebec, covering the Bloc Québécois, where leader Yves-François Blanchet is making a bit of a last-minute addition to his stops. He's at this factory impacted by U.S. President Donald Trump's tariffs. It also happens to be in the middle of a riding where the NDP are hoping to stage a comeback with former MP Ruth Ellen Brosso. She became a bit of a face of that 2011 orange wave that swept this province. Competition Blanchet does not need as he's struggling against the Liberals. He leaned hard into his entertainment industry roots today. Mocking rival Mark Carney's speech as sleep-inducing, Blanchet imitated a hypnotist, saying, "Your eyelids are getting heavy, you like fossil fuels." He then attacked the Conservative platform, calling it a bit of hocus-pocus. But Blanchet has his own magic trick to pull off as the election campaign nears its end. He has to convince Quebecers to tick next to the Bloc at the ballot box. Polls do have him on a bit of an upswing this week, but even with that, the CBC poll tracker has 10 Bloc seats set to disappear. David?
Okay, Rafi, thanks very much. The CBC's Rafi Boudjikanian with the Bloc campaign, where the leader is doing his impression of Ravine the Impossibilist, it seems. Françoise, let's talk a little bit about battleground Quebec. There is, some movement in the polls post the debates and everything that shows a little bit of tightening. What's your sense of the state of play there? Mark Carney back in Quebec, banging the Donald Trump drum after not doing that for about a week or so. Where do you think things stand there?
Well, I think Rafi was right in the sense that Yves-François Blanchet, I mean, it's his last few days of pitch, and his pitch is as follows. The Liberals are going to win. That's basically what he's kind of saying. So have no doubt about it. You need to have a strong contingency of Blocists to emphasize the interest of Quebecers.
Yeah.
Of Quebec, and that plus his performance during the debate, like you said, during Tout le monde en parle, where he was the last leader to be at that show. For him, it's his only pitch. So in writings that he thought he he had no difficulty. The Liberals being higher and the Conservatives being a good contender, not even though they wouldn't win. Well, or the NDP in the case of Yamachiche with Ruth-Hélène Brosseau, that makes him having to run a bit on different front because he will have a hard time retaining some of those seats. Another element that I find pretty fascinating, I don't know if other people than me noticed it, maybe Emily, but Pierre Poilievre used to start all of his press conference en français, in French. And it was endearing to a lot of Quebecers. I don't know if he just put an X on the province, realizing that what he has is pretty much what he's going to get, if even. Because for the last two major ones, his platform today and one last week after debate, I'm thinking, oh, he went back to starting in English and putting a bit of French and so on. Right. So it's little signs that tell. And for the Liberals, it's like there's so many writings that it can either steal maybe from the NDP and mostly from the Bloc. That's why you see Mark Carney in Laval for a big event tonight.
So Emily, the Liberal path to a majority, they want the number that comes out of Quebec to start with a 4, get over the 40-seat mark. But Mr. Blanchet, with this kind of move in the polls and this pitch of Carney's going to win, send a number of us to Ottawa. I mean, how do you think that is playing in terms of voters and with just a few days left to go?
Quebec is complicated because there's so many ways to do vote splitting. And so that's definitely an aspect of the map that you'll need to wait and see on Monday night. Because, for example, if there is even the slightest support for the NDP, some ridings might end up making a difference for the Bloc or the Liberals or the Conservative. And so there's very much 4 players there. Even 5 in my riding with Ramon, with Jonathan Pegnaud, there's so many ways in which this is a little bit messy. In terms of the issues, the thing with Yves-François Blanchet is that on some levels, he's campaigning very much against what Pierre Poilievre is saying, for example, in terms of defunding the CBC, which would, I don't know how that would not have an impact on Radio-Canada. And also it's been very much been defending the cultural sector of Quebec. At the same time, he's very close to Pierre Poilievre when it comes to issues of gender, trans rights, anti-wokeism, and so all of that. And so it's hard for him to paint one as the antichrist because he can play in both scenarios in terms. So if we were to have a minority government with the Bloc holding some level of power, what is Quebec interest has always been a mystery to me, and it certainly would be a mystery in terms of how it plays out in the House of Commons.
So, Michelle, any anxiety there as a Liberal in terms of what we're hearing from Mr. Blanchet and the movement we're seeing in Quebec? I mean, it still looks like a big Liberal lead and a significant amount of Liberal seats, but what's your sense of what's happening there?
There's tons of anxiety. I have anxiety about everything in the election campaign. I think that this is the way that the vote split is happening. This is not necessarily along the lines that it has traditionally, and so I think that there could be a lot of surprises out there. It's quite early. I know there's only 7 days left, but it's very early for Mr. Blanchet or Mr. Singh to be starting to concede to suggest that Mark Carney's going to win, and they're only doing that for their own kind of benefit, and all the power to them. That's politics. Yeah. But I think it is very tight. I think that it was a good turnout over this weekend, but that doesn't mean that it's going to be a stampede and might have more voters come election day than perhaps a few previous elections, but I don't know that it's going to reach like an 80% or a crazy high mark. And so I think it's, you have to go in the dynamics of riding by riding and not take anything for granted. And I think nothing is in the bag.
Yeah, I think it was 7 million voted over the weekend.
7.5
million.
7.3.
Yeah. So, I don't know. I feel like we are going to have high turnout because you've got a kind of polarized top line and both sides are quite motivated. Who knows? who knows? There are no facts in the future, but a lot is baked in. But Kate, I saw you nodding as Michelle was talking, which we haven't seen so far on the show, talking about the unpredictability of the vote split. So how do you see it going because of this polarized nature?
I wouldn't profess to be an expert in Quebec politics. We've just had two of them speak.
But the realignment of the electorate, it creates a lot of uncertainty, right?
Yeah, to me, it's the demographic shift that is happening, where traditionally Conservatives have relied on 60-year-old and up voters to show up for them. That happened in 2021. And now that it seems to be reversing itself, and you've got a lot of younger people that seem more compelled and interested in the Conservative message, and the Boomers looking more to Mark Carney and the Liberals, which I think could present some surprises. It could present some surprises in urban areas, suburban areas that have young families. I was hearing a lot about long lines at advanced polling stations in suburbs, including with a lot of young families in line. So we'll see what happens. But I think Michelle's quite right. There's interesting things happening in BC as well, which could result in some surprises. This has been an untraditional and unusual election, and that may be how we see the results play out next week as well.
Okay, you know what I'm going to do is get to the NDP story of the campaign today and sort of broaden it out to the conversation of how we see things going. Because NDP leader Jagmeet Singh, mentioning British Columbia, has been campaigning in BC since Friday, and his party's future hinges on what voters there decide. Singh met with local candidates and union leaders in Vancouver today. Afterwards, it was time to hit a new province. Singh will be in Edmonton tonight to hold an event with former Alberta Premier Rachel Notley.
Here in BC, your vote really matters. You can really make a difference between having that line of defense, that line in the sand saying New Democrats will never let this happen, or letting Mark Carney have a supermajority.
Singh had a similar message to supporters last night at a campaign rally in Port Moody. The CBC's Marina von Stackelberg is traveling with the NDP campaign. Marina.
Hey, David. Jagmeet Singh is calling on voters to help the NDP hold the line. It is a change in language that shows the party is now completely on the defense and trying to save the seats it has.
In this election, British Columbians will decide what happens next. Whether Mark Carney gets a supermajority or whether there are enough New Democrats in Parliament to hold the line, to fight for public health care.
Singh is back in Vancouver, trying to shore up support for his party here. BC is essential for the NDP. Half of the party's 24 House of Commons seats are in this province. At the party's first rally last night, former New Democrat MP Libby Davies told some 400 supporters to remind voters at the doorstep about what happened in 1993. That's when the NDP lost official party status, falling below 12 MPs in the House of Commons. Because of that, Davies says New Democrats didn't have the power to fight back against cuts the Liberal government made to social programs. The CBC poll tracker suggests the NDP could be on its way to lose official party status again. Reporters here also asked Singh if he'd resign if that happens. He repeated what he said in the past, that right now he's not thinking about what will happen after the election. But he did say it was the honor of his life to have pushed the Liberal government to bring in the Canadian Dental Care Plan. David?
Thank you, Marina. The CBC's Marina von Stackelberg in Vancouver. Emily, interesting to hear Jagmeet Singh talking about a super majority, not just a majority, because he wants NDP voters to feel a Carney victory is inevitable so they can come back to his party. And also the ghosts of 1993, where they lost party status, and also around when I started losing my hair. So I have some memory of that. What do you make of this pitch in the final days from Singh? Do you think it'll get him over the 12 seats?
And that's the thing about the polls, right, is that if Mark Carney was much higher in terms of, but what we've seen is actually the other way around. It's that we've seen the gap shrinking a little bit since the debates. And so for people who are hesitating with, between voting with their heart and with their heads, it's making Jagmeet's message a little bit harder to hear, although it's very much also depending on region to region. And so that might be a good pitch, especially to do in BC. But that's the thing as well about the NDP or this country in general, is that it's hard to have a national message when the electoral map of this country is so complicated. So I'm going to use a very weird word, but there are people who are living in some ridings when they can afford to vote NDP without creating getting a Conservative victory or even having a risk of that. But it's hard to have a message that speaks to anyone, to everyone, while also targeting those riding in terms of trying to motivate your supporters to actually show up for you, and not think about the national polls. And so it's what is wrong in many ways with our Westminster Parliament system and our first passable electoral system, but we're not going to fix that tonight, unfortunately.
No, well, I mean, if you give us another hour, we could probably figure something out. But Françoise, we do have to give the network away at 7 to Ian. But just on that pitch from Jagmeet Singh, right? He's talking about a supermajority. And look, the polls right now suggest a healthy majority, you know, for Mark Carney. But the top line numbers, they tighten. So there's narrative of poll tightening. Now, the regional splits in BC, Ontario, Quebec, and the Atlantic are still really good for the Liberals. But he's got a really tough environment in which he's trying to make this pitch. It requires New Democrat-inclined voters to do a lot of electoral calculus that they may not be able to do comfortably.
Definitely, and that's why, for the same reason the Bloc Québécois leader was saying pretty much the same thing, maybe not a super majority, but to give the sense of the people from their formation, political formation, listen, I know you're afraid, you want the Liberals to be at the helm, you want Mark Carney to be at the helm, but don't worry, you can still vote for us, the Bloc or the NDP, without impeaching that majority, because in the case of the NDP leader, it's going to be a super majority. And he has to make that pitch in BC for the same reason you mentioned, that's where half of their caucus is. I mean, if they can't win there, I don't know where they'll get their official status as a party. He has to go to Edmonton because it has been pretty good to the NDP. It is against over there, it's the Conservatives normally and the NDP. Now there's Liberals also in the mix. So he cannot take the seats that he have or that he would hope to have for granted. And after that, they have to go back to their way of doing voter turnouts and so on, like they did in Ontario, and maybe do a lot of prayers and hope for the best. And it's kind of ironic. It's kind of ironic and so unfair in politics that the guy who made the party that made the Liberal minority last almost like a majority government, and bring programs that people love, like the dental program and Medicare, gets absolutely no credit whatsoever because of what? Because of what is happening worldwide. But it shows that in politics, nothing is ever fair. And you do not get rewarded for good work, and you have to adapt. And sometimes, sadly, to say to my old party, this is not their strongest suit to adapt and turn on a dime without putting aside their moral concept, but to maybe go for what the people are looking for.
Yeah, look, if you read enough Shakespeare or like ancient Greek myth, you see this story arc all the time, right? They've done something, they get punished for the good work that they did in the service of their cause, and, you know, they kept the Liberals alive long enough to rebuild, rebrand, and maybe even destroy them. But, you know, Kate, this pitch they're making as a Conservative, I'm sure you want to see that catch on just about everywhere except Vancouver Island, Prairies, and southwestern Ontario, right? Yeah. But you would really love to see the New Democrats get back into that mid-teen sort of spot. Do you think it's going to resonate in the time that's left?
There's so little time left. And to Francois' point, yes, it's unfair, but the writing has been on the wall, I would say, for this really since the supply and confidence agreement was signed. The difference now, of course, they have no contrast to draw with the Liberals. And now we're in a circumstance where they can't wedge themselves into a conversation. And to me, the remarkable piece about that is a lot of the conversation is dominated by support for workers, support for jobs, making sure that Canadians can survive in this environment. And you would think that a strong NDP would find a place in that conversation. And to me, that is a reflection of how absent they have been from really the core of their value proposition for voters for some time. So yeah, as a Conservative, I'd love to see them polling 15%, 16%, because that would really shake things up. But I do think that it speaks to some real weaknesses that Jagmeet Singh has a leader to bring his party to this point, and now have them at 8, 9%. They're totally absent from the conversation, and that's been months and years in the making.
There is that tension inside the NDP between sort of the urban progressive component of the party and the sort of trade unionist component of the party, and Singh.
The latter one, or
the
former won out, and I think that we're seeing a real electoral consequence.
And their best chances to win, you know, Michelle may be in some of those blue-orange fights, maybe than some of the red-orange fights, the way it's going. But, you know, you sort of look at the incumbents they have running, like there's 1 in Quebec, there's 3 in Ontario, 2 in Manitoba, 2 in Alberta, and then everyone else in British Columbia and Nunavut. And BC is the ball game for them, and you know that province the best.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, you know, as we discussed earlier, just the dynamics of the vote splits and how, you know, some different surprises could actually occur, given how, you know, as Kate was saying, the demographics and kind of the voter coalitions are kind of shifting, and also, you know, if we do have a higher turnout in this election campaign, what's the impact of that as well? You know, clearly the overreaching question is about Donald Trump. And it's about who's going to be facing Donald Trump.
Is that the case in British Columbia? Sorry to interrupt you, but you can see that in Ontario, you can see that in Quebec, but David Eby makes the point that BC is the least trade-exposed province to the United States because of their Pacific access. Is it still the driving issue in BC?
If you look at our softwood lumber industry, it certainly is. You know, it's still very trade-reliant on the United States. Yes, they are better diversified to Asia, but still, over half of the trade is with the United States, right? So definitely better diversified. They also have all the ports out there, and so that is a major issue in terms of just managing that with respect to Asian ships coming over and whatever Trump is doing in terms of China and everything like that. So there's nothing simple about that, and absolutely BC and BC workers are very impacted. So I think that without question, that's the biggest thing on people's minds. It's certainly, and it's very much though, what are people, and Mr. Singh is going to make his case. They've got some strong incumbents out there, for sure, who've been there for a very long time, and so it'll be really interesting. And I don't think that the Liberals are taking anything for granted, nor do I think they can, because there's a long time still to play out. It's literally almost a quarter of the campaign still to go, or 20% of the campaign still to go. So you know, everyone's just got to kind of dig in and work for that last vote.
One thing I would just say on BC is I think a real potentially sleeper issue out there that may not be reflected elsewhere in the country is on crime. A lot of minority language communities, you know, urban, suburban communities, very worried about crime.
In the Surreys and Richmonds in particular,
I think
right?
I think that was the biggest point of contrast that I observed in the debate last week. The English language debate was Poilievre grilling Carney on crime, and what I would say was a fairly modest, inadequate response.
Okay, I wanted to show the numbers on the number of people who did vote in the advance voting, because a quick round on that, because we mentioned it earlier, record numbers at the advance poll, 7.3 million people voted this past long weekend. That's a 25% increase from the 2021 election, when 5.8 million Canadians voted in the advance polls. So Emily, I'm trying to find 28 million people are registered to vote at the beginning of this campaign. So this is about 25% of the potential electorate. And when you consider it's like 60, 65% turnout, normally, maybe higher this time, that's a big chunk that's already cast their vote. And it makes me wonder, so much of that happened right after the debate. Like, how much persuasion potential did the debates and what's left and the platforms actually have in this election if 7 million Canadians were ready to vote as soon as the debates ended, pretty much?
So first of all, when you look at the turnout at advanced polls, it looks like we're going to have high turnout on election day as well. And so that's something to factor in. In terms of what might persuade people to vote a certain way between now and election day, I think there's a player we haven't named, which is playing a really big role in people's brains, and it's the polls themselves. Because people are trying to make such complicated math, as we were just saying, in terms of who can I afford to vote for? Should I vote with my head? Should I vote with my heart? And if I vote with my head, what is my head saying? Depending on what's going on in my riding. And what's going on in my riding or what's going on nationally is basically informed by the polls. And so if we are seeing, for example, a gap shrinking between the Liberals and the Conservatives in this last week, just the fact that we're showing those graphs might influence how people vote more than what candidates actually say and what platforms actually say. And so this is what we're stuck in when we're making such strategic vote, is that people are basically looking at what their neighbors are doing, much more than they are looking at what the leaders are saying. And they're trying to form a group movement in one direction or the other, depending on the preferred outcome that they have, because there is no way that you can vote for, I wish I had a minority government of that color with that party holding the balance of power. And people are stuck trying to guess, kind of a little bit like the stock market. And this is what we're in. So I think the polls are actually really important between now and election day.
So, okay, we got to go quick because I get 10 on 10. But Francoise, I'm beginning to think this election has actually been baked in for a long time, because a lot of the movement in the polls actually happened in the weeks leading up to the election, and it's some variance, but it's been pretty stable all the way through for the most part. And the big turnout in the advanced polls suggests to me a lot of people made up their mind very early. I mean, what's your sense?
My sense is exactly that. I did go to the advanced poll because I'll be in Montreal for the soirée électorale à Radio-Canada. So I had to go vote this weekend, and I was in shock. I've never seen that. And I've been voting every year since I was of age to vote. And the lines, I had to wait an hour, which is maybe nothing compared to others who had to wait 2 hours, but gave me a chance as an ex-MP for the riding. I live in my riding, my ex-riding, and people were, it was the sense of emergency. You were talking about, oh, it's right after the debate and maybe it has zero impact. People were almost running to go vote because the word that I heard the most in the whole line talking with different people was they feel the urgency. It's an election like no other. Will it stay that way till Monday the 28th? I do suspect so. I do suspect it will have an impact, a bit like 1988 free trade election had on the number of voters. Some people don't agree with me, but I do suspect we'll be in a very high percentage of voters because people do feel that they need to say to their government, we understand there's an emergency and we have to vote.
Okay, yeah, look, I hope there's a high turnout. If you don't get a high turnout in an election like this, like what are we even doing? Kate, your thoughts then, Michelle?
I think it's a mug's game to try and interpret the high voter turnout to
100%.
mean anything for one party or another. I think the convenience of advanced voting has been, ticking up in past elections, and it was a 3, in some cases 4-day-long weekend for many workers, and I think that drove a lot of activity. To your point about things being baked, we're talking about, kind of tinkering with the margins in terms of the polling that's coming out now. So I suspect a lot of the vote has been people who have had their minds made up for some time, but I would be very reluctant to say that is an advantage for one side or another.
Completely agree, and was not trying to imply that, just decisiveness and motivation. That's all I take from it.
Exactly.
Michelle, your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree largely with Kate, and I would say it's the soft voters right now who are just trying to figure it out, and those are the ones that are coming out on election day, as well as the traditionalists. Like, there's no way you're going to convince my mother that you vote on any day except for election day. That's just not going to happen. So I think there's still a lot of game to be played.
All right, what a journey we're on. By the end of the hour, you two were agreeing on everything. That's great. All right, we're trying to bring everyone together here at the Big Round Table. Emily Nicolas, Francois Morin, Michelle Cadario, and Kate Harrison. Thank you so much, gang. Well, party leaders are spending a lot of time in British Columbia these days, a key battleground in this election. We're going to check in with 3 reporters there for how the race is playing out in that province. That's next. With less than a week to go until Election Day, one region of the country remains a tight race between the Liberals and the Conservatives and a smattering of NDP. In British Columbia, the CBC's poll tracker currently has the Liberals at 43.2%, with the Conservatives close behind at 38.8%. The NDP is only at 13.1%, and the Greens all the way back at just over 3% in the province. The main party leaders have all visited the province throughout the campaign. They'll be there again, trying to pitch their messages to voters.
It is fantastic to be back on Vancouver Island. As some of you know, I have family here.
So the question for British Columbians is, after a lost Liberal decade of skyrocketing costs and crime, can you afford a fourth Liberal term? Or is it time for a change?
Here in BC, you have an incredibly important role to play in this election. You can make the difference between Mark Carney getting a supermajority or sending enough New Democrats to Ottawa so we can fight to defend the things you care about.
Okay, to further break down how these messages are landing with voters in the province is our panel of BC political journalists. Rob Shaw is a political correspondent with Check News. Justine Hunter is a BC politics reporter with the Globe and Mail. And Katie DeRosa is the BC provincial affairs reporter for the CBC, a little-known outlet you may have heard of. Okay, Justine, I want to start with you. Let's look at the top-line numbers. It's this narrow lead for the Liberals in the province. What's your assessment of where things stand going into the final days of this campaign?
Well, I think because we have the potential for three-way races in some unusual ways, it would be really hard to predict the outcome at this point. But, you know, the BC in the last election divided the province so neatly between the three main parties here. We have basically 1/3 Liberals, 1/3 Conservatives, 1/3 NDP, and 1 Green, just for good measure. So I think we're going to see some big upsets, especially if these polling numbers around the NDP hold. You can just see the Liberals and the Conservatives have been sort of gathering around trying to figure out which NDP seats they can pick off.
Yeah, it is an interesting dynamic. So look, I'm going to get up and we're going to bring up the map just to show the color and just to show, look, the big picture. You know, Justine's right. You've got a lot of orange and blue. You get into the greater Vancouver area, it's a lot of red and orange, and you get over to Vancouver Island, which is the most mystifying place in Canadian politics, and I say that with great affection. You got some green and orange, and that is all kind of set to change potentially depending on how this goes. So Rob, let's start with you. You want to talk about northern British Columbia. Because early in the campaign, you know, Pierre Poilievre was there. He visited the NDP-held riding of Skeena-Bulkley Valley. This was Nathan Cullen's seat. It's Taylor Bacharach's seat. They've got Ellis Ross running there. What's your thoughts on what's happening in the north?
Yeah, well, Pierre Poilievre has put a lot of emphasis on areas like this. He has most of outside of Metro Vancouver and the island kind of locked up. Of those 10 ridings, 8 are Conservative, 2 are New Democrat. Boundaries Similkameen, or the Similkameen, South Okanagan, West Kootenay, I think it's called. The riding borders have changed, and that's a much closer Conservative race there. The Conservatives feel like they can take that riding from the NDP and take Skeena-Bulkley Valley. So they're looking at trying to have all 10 ridings outside of Metro Vancouver, plus come down the North Island into the middle of the island and pick up 3-4 more ridings there, and then pick up some ridings in Metro Vancouver. They're very bullish, and that's why Poilievre has spent, I think, 19 visits there since he became leader, 3 so far in the campaign, and he's targeting the working class, blue-collar, hard hat-wearing, former New Democrat workers and voters in those resource industries.
Yeah, it's the scavenging of the NDP ridings, as Justine was laying out. So, Katie, you want to talk a little bit about, you know, Rob mentioned Vancouver Island and sort of coming in from the north here that the Conservatives are looking to do. What's your sense of the dynamic there? Because there's a lot of buzz that the Liberals might be in play in places like Victoria, which they haven't won since David Anderson, I think, was the MP there 20-odd years ago.
Yeah, so, you know, Vancouver Island really does buck national trends. 6 of the 7 ridings right now are orange, and that includes Victoria with Laurel Collins. As she had pointed out, that riding of Victoria has been NDP for 20 years, but that could change with the Liberal candidate Will Greaves right now polling showing he's edging out a little bit, still a 2-horse race, but that's an example where Mark Carney's popularity is boosting the local candidate as opposed to the reputation of the local candidate. Also in Saanich Gulf Islands, Elizabeth May is really trying to hold on to that seat. Of course, she took it from Gary Lunn, a Conservative, in 2011, and now she's battling with a Conservative, Cathy Unstead, and being edged out a little bit by the Conservatives in that riding. So what is right now a orange and green island could very much turn blue and red.
Okay, so Justine, I just wanted your thoughts on that, because I wonder, we don't talk about the Greens too much. You know, they don't have party status. They've only got 2 seats. They got evicted from the debate. Is Elizabeth May really in trouble? Because it seems like she is the eternal cornerstone of the party in both Parliament and in the leadership mix somewhere. Well, what's your sense of what's going to happen on Vancouver Island, potentially?
Well, she moved out to Sydney in this little community in the center of the riding because the Greens had identified that as the most likely place in the country to support a Green candidate. And she was right. In fact, they have a Green provincial MLA for the region as well. So there's a strong Green contingent out there. But I went out and sat down and had coffee with some of the locals a couple of weeks ago, and really got the sense that people are reassessing their options right now. You know, obviously things can change but you know, there was a lot of talk at the time about the Trump tariffs and the threat to Canada's economy. And people were saying, I really like Elizabeth May as a local candidate. She's a great MP. But, and then, you know, people talking about either the Conservatives or the Liberals in that riding, even people that had no idea who the Liberal candidate is in Saanich and the Gulf Islands, they were just saying, I want to vote for the guy that is representing Mark Carney's party.
Right. So Rob, just on that, because where you started with talking about Vancouver Island, I have a friend who lives there who said to me that the NDP, in his assessment, is a luxury you cannot afford in a crisis, is how he described the way voters are going. And where this is an election polarizing about Prime Minister, who's the best Prime Minister, that's a tough one for Jagmeet Singh. Is that how you see it playing out here in terms of the 7 ridings on that island?
Yeah, I mean, the national polls have scared the bejesus out of the local New Democrats here. I think I can say that word on CBC.
It's a political science term, so you're good. Yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah. You have New Democrats telling me that when they go door knocking, even folks who voted for them in the past are saying, and much like your guests previous to us were saying, that folks are thinking strategically because of the national polls. They're spending a lot of time on the doors saying, and they're putting signs out on lawns now saying that the NDP is your vote to block the Conservatives in ridings like on Vancouver Island. That's the message that they are pushing. And it makes it tough because there are some races, as Katie's pointed out, where, you know, the Liberals have the potential to kind of squeak up the middle in some cases, and some races where you have blue and orange fights up in the Mid-Island to the North Island, including in Nanaimo, where folks are kind of scared. They have to be reassured to vote New Democrat. And the worry from the NDP is that if Carney's rising tide raises all boats and pulls away from them, that the Conservatives just walk away with some of those ridings based on the fear of national polls that might not translate into riding level results here on the island.
There is a real possibility of a red and blue Vancouver Island with no orange and no green, which is a remarkable thing that I didn't see coming at the beginning of this election campaign. But look, Katie, I wonder if we can just shift our focus to the Lower Mainland, the greater Vancouver area, right? You tend to get the red-orange fights in Vancouver proper, and then it moves into a bit of a red-blue as you get into the Richmond, Surrey, Steveston, these things, and then the Tri-City areas. How do you see this area playing out with the way the polls are going and with the sort of the implied weakness of the NDP in a place where they're typically pretty strong?
Well, certainly everyone's going to be looking at Burnaby Central on election night to see if Jagmeet Singh can hold on to his riding. Right now, polls are putting him in third behind the Conservatives and the Liberals, so that would be a really tough blow for him. The Metro Vancouver area is really sort of an urban area where any orange seats, the Liberals are really closely targeting. There's a star candidate, Gregor Robertson, former Vancouver mayor, who, Pierre Poilievre has name-dropped specifically in many of his speeches when he's in BC, saying that he's the architect of BC's liberal drug policies that have created what he called drug dens. So clearly that that candidate has come under fire. But when Poilievre has visited some of these communities, he's really focusing on crime and drugs in these urban areas, saying that the Liberal record has created that, and so he's really capitalizing on that message. But I spoke to voters, potential voters in East Vancouver last week, and there's still many mentioning tariffs and tariffs combined with affordability as a top issue. So that is an area where voters are trying to decide the top issue for them and which party leader is best to play that out.
So Justine, there's 43 seats in British Columbia. It seems pretty, well, I mean, the Conservatives and the Liberals have the most. It seems pretty clear that's how it's going to go in some order, unless there's a dramatic change. But what's your sense of the NDP's ability to hold on to these Vancouver seats? You're seeing Don Davies putting the strategic vote sign on top of his normal sign. And you do have the leader running there. And, I know he's been elected out there, but he's kind of an Ontario politician. I mean, what's your sense of their ability to hold in the capital, sorry, not in the capital city, in the biggest city there?
Yeah, no, clearly the New Democrats are concerned, and we had redistribution in the last before this election. So Jagmeet Singh's riding of Burnaby South, where he won twice, is no longer really his riding. It's sort of partially that, and so he's also had to kind of reestablish himself in his own riding, and we've also seen a couple of fairly high-profile New Democrats coming out and saying that people should be thinking about the Mark Carney and the Liberals in this election. One of them was former Premier Mike Harcourt, who was rebutting an endorsement from Gordon Campbell for the Pierre Poilievre, because our former premiers don't like to ever retire. But also Cathy Corrigan. Now, she was a cabinet minister in the NDP government here, but she's also married to the former mayor of Burnaby, Derek Corrigan. And so that power couple, well-connected in Burnaby. And there she was suggesting that the Liberals would be a better option this time out. So I think the New Democrats officially in British Columbia, the provincial government, and Premier Evie have endorsed the NDP out here, but I don't know that their heart is in it this time around. And so I do think the federal New Democrats are concerned.
Rob,
this is 12 seats for the NDP. So this is just BC could deliver them official standing in the House if they could hold on to these seats.
Well, Rob, that's where I wanted to go with you. I mean, it's a goat's path to official party status, right? It winds and twists and it requires wins in multiple parts of the country, but BC is what's going to put it over the top or not. I mean, what's your sense right now of how many seats it looks like the New Democrats can hold on in their their most important province right now?
Well, I think there's 5 in Metro Vancouver. And look, if they lose, Vancouver East, Vancouver Kingsway, and New Westminster, Jenny Kwan, Dan Davies, Peter Julian seat, they're in trouble. Like there's no orange on the island at that point, right? Like you are effectively kind of done. Those are the 3 safest New Democrat seats. So we'll see what those results are. We might not be talking about the New Democrats if they're losing those ridings. But, it's the Conservatives that are kind of coming in classic fashion because we have this rural-urban divide in British Columbia, and it ebbs and flows. They're coming in from the kind of Abbotsford, Langley, sort of Fraser Valley area. They want to come up through Surrey and the many ridings in Surrey because they did well provincially. The BC Conservatives and in the crime and addictions messaging goes well in different Surrey communities, and come around in Richmond and in some of the ethnic communities there. And so they're looking at picking up seats, pushing the Liberals back, the NDP getting squeezed in, and it is entirely possible, if those 3 ridings don't go NDP, that is a catastrophic night for that party. Yeah, like
the story of Canadian elections is typically whoever wins the suburbs wins the government, right? When the suburbs side with rural Canada, it's Conservative. When they side with urban Canada, it's Liberal. But just Rob, one last question about the 5 in Vancouver. Is Singh, Peter Julian, Don Davies, Jenny Kwan would probably be the strongest of those 5? Is Singh the 4th place in terms of his ability to hold on, or would he be 5th, do you think?
I think he's 5th. The New Democrats tell me they think Gord Johns in the Courtenay sort of Alberni area in the Mid-Island has a better chance at this point. So that's very worrying for the NDP leader and doesn't bode well for New Democrats. But look, there is always a possibility that name recognition, which is not an incumbency, which is not picked up in polling that well, helps those folks, longtime MPs, well respected in their community, kind of carry ridings that otherwise are collapsing underneath them, like kind of a rope bridge falling apart as they run to the finish line. And don't count them out.
Oh, Katie, I want to ask you one last question. We've all been following sort of the drama I think it's in Okanagan, where Mike DeYoung is running as an independent. Any insight? What do we think is going to happen there? Is it possible nomination troubles with the Conservatives could cost them a seat?
Well, you know, I think that's an area where the Conservatives may have made a misstep. They misjudged Mike de Jong's popularity in that community. Lots of people we talked to said they're considering voting independent because they like Mike de Jong. He was their MLA for 30 years, and yet the Conservative Party said he didn't have the experience. So certainly he's putting up quite the fight, and that could be an interesting riding to watch. He's up against a Conservative candidate who's 24 years old. And so that's going to be certainly an area. Well, can Mike de Jong give the independent a seat? Yeah. So he's certainly hoping for that. And I think he's running to kind of say a little bit of a kick in the teeth back to the party for not choosing him and saying, well, I'm going to run anyways, and let's see what happens. But certainly that is an area that has typically voted Conservative. So whether he could turn that around, we'll have to see.
Yeah, there's a few ridings with similar storylines across the country I'm going to be paying attention to on Monday night. Gang, I can't wait to see what actually happens in British Columbia. It's good to see you all again. Rob Shaw, Justine Hunter, and Katie DeRosa, thanks so much.
Thanks, David.
The Vatican has announced that the funeral for Pope Francis will be held this Saturday at 10 a.m. local time, 4 a.m. Eastern, with tens of thousands expected to attend. The Vatican also released these images of the Pope's body lying in his private chapel at Casa Santa Marta last night. It will be moved tomorrow in a procession to St. Peter's Basilica. The CBC's Briar Stewart joins us now. So Briar, what do we know about how the next few days will play out and what the funeral arrangements for this weekend will be?
Yeah, David, well, that procession is going to begin first thing tomorrow morning. And in fact, we expect that people will start lining up throughout the night so they can get a chance to pay their respects to Pope Francis. Now, he will be lying in state at St. Peter's Basilica for the next 3 days. And we do expect a very large crowd to be here to pay their respects. And then, of course, on Saturday, that is when the funeral mass will be. The Dean of the College of Cardinals will be delivering that mass. And you will have dozens of world leaders who will be coming to Rome for this. You will have presidents, prime ministers, and members of the royalty. Several European leaders are going to be here, including Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky. The President of Argentina will be here, because obviously that is where Pope Francis grew up. That is where he's from. And U.S. President Donald Trump will be coming as well, making his way to Rome on Friday. And this will be Trump's first foreign trip during his second term of office. And so a lot of world leaders, and in terms of Canada's officials here on the ground, there are indications that Mark Carney will not be attending, obviously given the federal election. And if that is the case, then it's customary that the Governor General of Canada would attend instead. So that likely could happen. But with so many world leaders here and such a huge crowd expected, I can tell you that security has really been stepped up. It was heightened during the day, and they're rolling out more barriers tonight ahead of the large crowds that will begin tomorrow.
So, Briar, do we have specific details yet about the conclave or when the new pope will officially be elected?
No specific details, but I can tell you Vatican officials keep getting asked that question during the briefings, and they say that clarity will come after the funeral mass. We can expect it to happen within the coming days, and the conclave is when we will see cardinals from all over the world descend on the Vatican City for debate and discussion, and ultimately that secretive vote to elect a new head of the Catholic Church. And there are a lot of lists out there touting possible front runners and a lot of names, but this is a process that's frequently unpredictable. Pope Francis, when he was elected in 2013, he was seen as an outsider. And so you have a lot of possibilities, but really the question that the Cardinals are facing is just whether they elect somebody to kind of follow on in Francis's legacy, somebody that's more moderate, progressive on certain issues, or does they elect somebody who wants to tilt the church back down a more more conservative path? I think that's a key question that not only cardinals are discussing, but members of the Catholic faith. And of course, all of that will play out in the coming days after the funeral mass and when the conclave begins.
Briar, thank you so much. That's the CBC's Briar Stewart in Rome.
Welcome.
White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt says illegal border crossings are down, citing the success of the Trump effect. So what could this mean for President Trump's justification for tariffs on Canada? The CBC's Katie Simpson has the latest. She joins us now from Washington. So Katie, the Canada-US border came up today in today's White House briefing. What exactly is the press secretary saying about this?
Yeah, Donald Trump and his team always are talking about largely the southern border and the decrease in the number of people who are either crossing into the United States illegally or trying to cross in the United States illegally. But today, the northern border came up, specifically a section of the northern border, sort of in, southwestern, or not so, part of Ontario, part of Quebec, and bordering sort of up on New York, up on Maine, and a change in the pace of the number of people trying to cross into the United States illegally there. This came at the very start of the White House briefing, and it is significant because the White House is pointing to this section of the northern border and calling it a win. We'll talk more about that in a second, but have a listen to what the White House press secretary said.
According to U.S. Customs and Border Protection, just 54 illegal aliens were apprehended in the Swanton sector of our northern border, which stretches more than 300 miles in March. This is a drastic 95% drop from the more than 1,000 border crossings that were caught in March 2024. This is a main hotspot area that recorded more than 80% of all apprehensions along the northern border during the 2024 fiscal year.
Now, the reason this is so significant for the Canada-U.S. relationship is, remember, the Trump administration has imposed 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico as a result of what Donald Trump says are sort of lax border policies. He's concerned about the number of people crossing into the United States illegally and the amount of fentanyl that is crossing into the United States. Now, Canada, as it was trying to come up with a response to Donald Trump when sort of he was either threatening or in this initial stage of imposing this, Canada pledged $1 billion in spending to improve border security. And even though Canada was responsible for less than 1% of the amount of fentanyl that was seized by American authorities, which has even gone down since those new border plans were put in place, and the number of people crossing the United States, it was significantly lower than what you see at the southern border. And so it was always, the question was, is Donald Trump looking for a win? Is he looking for something he can point to, perhaps to sort of say, listen, I did this is a win, and look how, wonderful my policies are. And so when the White House says something like that, it's something that officials in Ottawa will listen to as they hope that there is some sort of relief on the way from those tariffs. But again, at this point, those tariffs remain in place. There are some carve-outs for CUSMA-compliant goods, though.
All right, yeah, illegal border crossings down, legal ones too, because people are just not vacationing and shopping in the United States these days. Okay, look, the big story I was paying attention to is that President Trump was talking a lot about getting rid of the Federal Reserve Chair, Jerome Powell, but he brought some clarity to all of that today. We got a bit more clarity.
Yeah, investors have been rattled by the way that Donald Trump has been talking about Jerome Powell. He has openly said he will put political pressure on the Federal Reserve Chair to lower interest rates. He points to other jurisdictions that have already lowered interest rates, and he thinks he's acting too slowly. This spooks investors because if Donald Trump is going to try and do something beyond, the Fed is independent, and if Donald Trump is going to try and breach that wall, it's something that has made investors very, very nervous. But today, Donald Trump said very unequivocally that he's going to allow Jerome Powell to continue on. Have a listen.
I have no intention of firing him. I would like to see him be a little more active in terms of his idea to lower interest rates. This is a perfect time to lower interest rates.
So we know that behind the scenes, according to some U.S. reporting, that Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, has been trying to urge Trump and members of his inner circle to sort of lay off because, again, all of this talk directed at Powell has been really, really making investors nervous and uncomfortable.
Okay, Katie, there's so many big stories in the United States because the president is also defending his deportation plan that has sent people to countries, whether they should have gone or not. It's been paused by the Supreme Court. What's he saying there?
Yeah, I feel like there's so many different things we could talk about, and we're just sort of scratching the surface because the way things are changing in the United States is going so quickly. Just really quickly on this, Donald Trump is trying to use this wartime, rarely used power from the 1800s called the Alien Enemies Act to deport people that the U.S. government has declared threats to the United States. They say gang members, members of MS-13, and they're trying to deport them quickly out of the country. However, the Supreme Court put a pause to one aspect of the program over the weekend, saying, listen, these people need to have due process. Today, Donald Trump responded, speaking about how he's hoping that that his administration will continue this fight in the courts and have some wins.
And I hope we get cooperation from the courts because, you know, we have thousands of people that are ready to go out, and you can't have a trial for all of these people. It wasn't meant, the system wasn't meant.
Now, a traditional trial in the sense of what Donald Trump is talking about there, that's not necessarily what happens in these cases. One judge at a lower court ruling says these people need 21 days. It's about giving them the right to appeal the deportation order. Some of these people have already gone before a justice, and then you know, their immigration status, they have been denied asylum claims. But again, some of these people the Trump administration says are gang members and make allegation that they are violent criminals. In some cases, there has been evidence, but in a lot of the cases, we haven't seen that. And of course, that is sort of the heart of another case involving a man from Maryland who was deported wrongly by the Trump administration, sent to a notorious prison in El Salvador. So again, Donald Trump is hoping that the Trump administration can push ahead with its legal challenges. They plan to fight and push as hard as they can. The stop by the Supreme Court was just temporary. And again, this is just like one of several things. The State Department's going to cut staff apparently by 15%. That's another thing. Elon Musk is preparing to focus more on Tesla. That's another thing. So it's just thing after thing after thing after thing after thing.
Yeah, the defense secretary may get forced out because a bunch of leaky staff and all this. Anyway, it is, boy, oh boy. Katie, thank you for helping us deal with it as best we can. The CBC's Katie Simpson in Washington today. All right, coming up, we've got three journalists here to talk about the key moments that caught their attention on the campaign trail today, like the Conservatives releasing their platform.
Canadians have been pinching their pennies long enough. It's time for government to start pinching pennies as well.
But do Pierre Poilievre's numbers add up? That discussion up next. Welcome back to Power and Politics. It's day 31 of the federal election campaign as the Conservatives became the last main party to release their costed platform. It had all the party leaders talking dollars and cents today.
A Conservative government understands that a dollar left in the hands of the person who earned it is always better spent than a dollar in the hands of the politician who taxed it.
These numbers are a joke. We aren't in a joke. We are in the worst crisis of our lives. It takes a serious government. It takes a serious plan.
It's very easy to say, vote with us. There will be less taxes.
The Conservative math is not mathing. No. If you look at what they're proposing, the numbers are not based in any reality.
Okay, we're going to check in with our Power Rankings panel now to see what's caught their attention on the campaign trail today. I'm joined by Marty Patrickin, who is the Quebec correspondent for The Logic. Laura Stone is with the Globe and Mail. And here with me in studio, journalist and author Paul Wells. Paul, let's start with you. I don't know if you've read both of the platforms, but Kevin Page and his team sure have, and they give a pass to the Conservatives and a good assessment to the Liberals. They have some credibility issues, they say, with the revenue assumptions in the Conservative plan that makes their deficits look lower. Do you think these things matter, platforms this late in the campaign, those grades? What do you think?
Someday we should have a discussion about the utility of these costed platforms.
Yes.
There's actually an academic book out there that checks how well Trudeau delivered on his 2019-2021 platforms, in which I wrote the introduction and I say, let's just stop doing this.
Yeah.
Because it's clear it's like pulling teeth. It's clear the parties hate to do it. They put it off as long as possible. Pierre Poilievre showed some ingenuity in burying his own platform with a distracting other story today. And in 3 years, whatever happens to whatever government, it's not going to look like what's in these platforms.
Well, I mean, even the baseline financial assumptions that are here, Marty, that came from the parliamentary budget officer kind of predates, and this is not a criticism of the PBO, but like Trump, right? Like everything has changed. So you have to start somewhere, I suppose, but that somewhere is no longer real.
Yeah, I was talking to a pollster this weekend about it. I was just talking about because everybody kept saying costed platforms. I'm like, what is the political benefit of doing this during a campaign? And his point was basically, look, there might have been some benefit back in the day. There isn't in general in more modern day politics, and there isn't acutely with this specific election. And I thought about what he said when I read today that the advanced polling is up. I think we were at 7.2 million.
7.3 actually.
7.3 million, above 5 and change in 2021. A massive jump. I'm going to suggest that the people that are going in there and doing this, that are showing such energetic spirituality or whatever it is that's driving them out to go and vote. I don't think this has anything to do with costed platforms. I think the narratives of the campaign have long congealed. Whether it's Mark Carney is best as a steady hand for the rest for the country going forward, or if you're the Conservatives, you're like, this is where we have to stop this 10-year business. This is insane. We have to change government, change course. I don't think that's going to move one way or another with any sort of costed platform.
I don't know, Laura. 7.3 million voted in the advanced polls, but that could mean 21 million Canadians were waiting for the costed platforms. I don't know. What do you think?
With bated breath, David. No, I think they do matter.
I do too.
I agree that you can't, I think everyone understands that changes happen once you're in government, events happen, and you can't necessarily stick to this. But I think this gives voters a sense of the direction of a future government, of the ethos, of priorities, of specific measures and ideas, right? And we have here in the Conservative platform, for instance, not requiring public servants to have a university degree necessarily. That might get some people's attention, and they might say, hey, that's a common sense idea. I like that. It's not going to maybe significantly change a huge number of votes, but I think it presents to the public not just the costing measures, but what a certain government would look like. What are their policy ideas and direction for the country? So in that sense, I think it is still valuable, and I think people are still interested in reading it. Of course, if you're an advanced voter, your mind's already made up. You're likely very informed already, but I think people probably are reading these stories, or at least the summaries of what the platforms say, and basing somewhat their vote on what's contained in them.
Yeah, I always look at it as sort of a bit of a stress test for the seriousness of your financial assumptions and your policy measures and these sorts of things, but that's a very granular bubble political host kind of thing.
Yeah.
So
subset of a subset.
Yeah, exactly. But you know, I like to think I'm a very important subset, like Gen X, who keeps getting ignored. All right, Laura, let's get to your pick. You want to talk about Carney sort of flexing his resume and economic experience in this campaign. What are your thoughts there?
Well, to me, this is the ballot question. It's about leadership. It's about who's ready to lead the country and how the ballot question has been framed. And clearly, for Mr. Carney, in his eyes, it's who's best to take on President Trump, but who has the economic chops to do so. And I think the contrast between him and Mr. Poilievre today, who doesn't have the resume, as we've heard repeatedly from the Conservatives, of a Mark Carney, but you know, he's supposed to, I guess, represent more the younger generation, viewed more as a disruptor in politics. I think Mr. Carney's reaction to this was really interesting and sort of marked the moment of what this campaign is about. Him saying essentially, Pierre Poilievre doesn't know what he's talking about. He's never done this. I'm the fiscal manager. I know, how to lead Canada through this fiscal crisis. I think that's probably going to punch through for a lot of voters, and why we're seeing the polls trend in the direction that they are trending. And yet, the Liberals are the safe choice here, right? It is a bit more of a continuation of the same versus someone like a Poilievre who's coming in and trying to shake things up. And so I think, Carney tried to frame that as the ballot question, as him being the person with experience, with financial experience, right, significant financial experience, is probably kind of the leading point that the Liberals were trying to make today.
Yeah, Paul, this dynamic with the Liberals, I know how much you love sports analogies, right? But it's like they fired the coach, right? They got a new coach, and it shakes up the team because the players are very similar, but it is, the new guy at the top that has changed kind of the focus of how they spend and how voters are looking at them right now.
Wait for it. With his platform today, Poilievre has pulled the goalie. He has, it's the name of the platform, the word on the. I'm done. That's my last sports metaphor for 25.
Yeah. Quota hit.
It's change. Every poll shows. David Coletto was the one at Abacus who started pointing this out. If the question is Trump, Carney wins. If the question is change, Poilievre is at least competitive and maybe ahead. And so he has said that, this is my. He was saying for a change, but now he's dropped the for because that was confusing, and now he's just changed. And I think they're both awfully optimistic in their revenue projections. Carney thinks that this debt financing instrument for the green transition will bring in, dozens of billions of dollars internationally for investment in Canada. President Trump is doing everything he can to make sure that nobody invests a dime in Canada.
Yeah.
And Poilievre's, he's done a thing that Jean Charest did in Quebec in '98, which is to say, my mere arrival will increase government revenues because people will be so relieved that I'm here. We'll see.
Yeah, that's how I pitched myself in the job interview for this show. Marty, your thoughts on where this is? I mean, it is the resume that's resonating in Quebec and seemingly in other parts of the country. What do you thought of the way it played out today?
I take Laura's point was a good one. The economic chops and him hammering that home. What has been fascinating to me in the campaign for just as far as Mr. Carney's concerned is the delivery. Every election that I've covered, certainly since being a journalist, there's always been some sort of put it this like fire on the part of the leader that's in place to basically push it forward and to demonize the other guy. I have never been part of a campaign or covered a campaign where the guy who's ahead is being pushed forwards by all the circumstances around him, and it's almost he's almost making headlines and getting ahead despite himself. Mark Carney's not a particularly good campaigner. He's stodgy. He's pretty gray, and it's fascinating to watch the fact that he's able to do that despite this, and it sort of says a lot about what's going on in the United States also. And I also think that there's a sort of like you can put a definitive end to the Justin Trudeau era in the sense of delivery and context of the way that messages are delivered. Mr. Trudeau was everywhere, and Mr. Carney certainly is not.
What I find, just as a final point before we get the Paul's pick, is what I find interesting about Carney compared to Trudeau is he doesn't litigate criticisms the same way. Like when they say, oh, you let too many immigrants in, he goes, yeah, we messed that up, and here's what we're going to do to fix it. There's no argument that, well, we did it this way, we did it that way. It's a stark contrast in the way they do those things, right? So Paul, people were talking about platforms today, and Pierre Poilievre was also talking about a government report that was kind of like a Cormac McCarthy novel in its sort of dystopian nature. I mean, this is what you wanted to talk about today.
Was it The Road? The one?
Yeah, The Road.
The Viggo Mortensen movie? Yeah, all I read was the Border trilogy. He said he took a long detour from announcing his platform to say, look, there's this government report that says that in 2040 it's going to be dogs and cats living together and widespread poverty and children unable to eat and he said it's not, but this isn't me, this is this government report that's authoritative. It comes from something called Policy Horizons Canada. I've written about this incidentally on my Substack. It is a small speculative unit within the bureaucracy that generates hypotheses about weird stuff that might happen. Yeah. They've also suggested that there could be a booming industry in homemade bioweapons. They've suggested there could be a world war because of economic inequality. Right. And they've suggested that there could be a second civil war in the United States. Or on the other hand, none of that will happen. I mean,
it's kind of wargaming and disaster scenario assessment, hypotheticals.
I mean, the policy,
by a bureaucrat.
The platform that, or the thing that Poilievre quoted today, actually an acquaintance of mine helped to write it, and this is what they do for a living: is what if well, one of the other ones is that the Arctic could boom because of global warming, and suddenly everyone wants to live in the Arctic, right? Sure. And again, on the other hand, maybe not. And Poilievre knows that. Incidentally, that little skunkworks, that little unit in government, now operates out of Poilievre's old department in government, ESDC. Right. And his own policy director wrote a column for the Ottawa Citizen 6 years ago saying, let's shut the thing down. So he knows exactly what this is about.
It's not predictive, and it's not necessarily this is where it's going. It's just hypothesis, and how do you plan for avoiding it? Is that that's
well, this is it. It's like the old Saturday Night Live sketch. What if the Roman centurions had a Cessna? Like, yeah. It's something that could happen. And it is silly of him. It's worse than silly. It's irresponsible of him to stoke fear over something whose nature he knows exactly what it is. One of the other recent reports that this organization has produced is, what if it becomes so hard for voters to tell what's true from what's false because irresponsible public figures mislead them, that they can't exercise their democratic rights? That one is recommended reading.
Yes, that is an interesting one. Laura, what do you make of this? This was one of the 4 questions he took today at his platform launch. Joe Warmington, I think, from the Sun chain, asked the question. And it does paint this sort of apocalyptic hellscape that is a low probability outcome here.
Yes, I mean, I and I'm sure many people have never heard of this area of government. We had to sort of look it up and read the fine print that it's not really a Government of Canada document. It's a predictive measure. I would venture to guess that the bureaucrats of Policy Horizons are not getting fired in Pierre Poilievre's Canada after today. But look, I think it's clearly over the top, but I think that the sentiments are valid that are part of this, right? I mean, you see things like, by 2040, no one will be able to afford a house, and you have to have inherited wealth. Well, like, welcome to right now, right? I mean, when we're talking about the issues affecting people, particularly young people today, it actually is true, right? I mean, people cannot afford to live in this country right now, and maybe we won't be hunting and pillaging and foraging in 15 years for food, or maybe we will, but according to this document. But I think kind of some of the ideas, when you strip back some of the exaggerative language, I think are valid, and sort of what the Conservatives are trying to capture with their policy platform today, right? Their costed platform, which is life is really expensive, and there doesn't seem to be an out. And so these are our proposals for it. You know, whether it deserved to have all the attention drawn to it today, I think that's another question. But I think some of the points made probably strike a tone with a lot of voters, particularly young people. Yeah,
but Marty, there's a way to talk about the serious challenges people are facing without, contemplating a futuristic societal situation where wide-scale poaching is the only way to eat, right? Which is what it kind of talks about.
Yeah, look, I mean, the subtext of all of it, frankly, was, and Laura put her finger on it there, was it's almost like a situation of like, do this or else, like vote for us or don't vote for that guy because this is what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And it sort of shows a level of panic on the part of the campaign. Yves-François Blanchet, while he didn't divest himself of this particular report, was doing a similar thing during the campaign. He was saying, look, if you vote for the Liberals, it's going to be unchecked immigration and the death of French. All the old things that he didn't want to campaign on was forced to campaign on because all the rest of the playbook went out the window with Mark Carney and Donald Trump. Paul was saying pull the goalie. I don't know what the second analogy of that is, but it's just like trying to get as many players in the ice as possible for the last.
Yeah,
because you're well behind in the polls.
There's a Kang and Kodos sort of dynamic to some of that today, going back to the Simpsons presidential election episodes. Okay, we got about 4 minutes left here, Marty. You mentioned Mr. Blanchet. You want to talk about what's happening with the Bloc in Quebec right now?
Well, the Bloc, and look, I talked about this a couple of weeks ago, and I've said it since. Like the turning point for me in the campaign, and this is strictly from a Quebec point of view, was the extent to which Quebecers embraced the Liberals after Mr. Trudeau's political demise, and it sort of all came together with that Lovin at the beginning of this. Call it a Lovin. That's a 1995 reference if there ever was one, but. At the beginning of April, when thousands of Quebecers thousands of Montrealers went up to Mount Royal and set up and listened to people like Françoise David and Émile Bilodeau, these devoted sovereignists, stand there and say how bad the United States is and how bad Donald Trump is, and the place was littered with Canadian flags, like the Canadian, like the maple leaf kind, not the hockey team, though there were a few of those, and it's something. It's something I've never seen in this province, and it just goes to show that when push comes to shove, that people are fundamentally Canadian across the country, even here in Quebec, and also that there's a long-standing there's implications of this. There was a poll out in January from, I want to say Polaris. Anyway, I know it was Angus Reid.
Yeah.
Talking about 51st state and patriotism. Where was the patriotism? Where was the biggest jump in patriotism when we were talking about Trump? It's right here in Quebec. That has massive implications, not only for the federal election coming up, but for the provincial election next year.
Okay. Laura, quick 30 seconds of that, and then I want to finish with Paul here.
It's not cool to be down on Canada anymore after this episode with Trump, right? And this kind of bizarro, stunning turnaround that we've seen from the Liberal Party. If they are able to pull this off, if they are able to secure a majority, this will be talked about in literature and textbooks and texts for decades, right? The fact that the Conservatives have somehow lost the lead. If the Liberals are able to break through even further in Quebec, I mean, this was unthinkable a few months ago, and the fact that it's turned around so quickly, seemingly according to the polls, we'll see what happens in a week, but that truly is a story of the campaign, right, and how much the newfound kind of patriotism has brought everyone together.
Paul, we got Jagmeet Singh talking about a Carney supermajority, and Mr. Blanchet saying he's going to win, so send Bloc to Ottawa. I mean, what do you make of the dynamic that we're seeing there in Quebec?
Some pollsters have shown a little bit of upward movement in both the NDP and the Bloc support. I'll tell you how it's going to work out as soon as it's over. But Quebec continues to be the place where so many parties put so much of their hope, because there are a lot of ridings there that have been represented by 4 different parties in the last 25 years. And so why not put your chips down and see how you do?
Do you think, having worked there with the Gazette and other things, I mean, do you think there's a receptibility in the audience or in the electorate to the Carney's going to win, so send more BQ? Do you think that can do it?
I think it's likely to go a little bit the other way, which is Carney's going to win, and that's fine. Léger polled on perceptions of his French in the debate, and more than a third of respondents said his French was good enough, or exceeded expectations.
Right. Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So that looks like a green flag all the way.
It's interesting that for the Liberals to get back to their high water marks in Quebec. They just needed a central banker from Edmonton with, who struggles in French.
It's the weirdest thing, man.
It's the weirdest election of all time. We got to say goodbye. We're out of time. The election is nearing the end point. Laura Stone, Marty Patrick, and Paul Wells. I am David Cochrane. Thank you all for watching Power in Politics. We're back in 22 hours with the next edition of the show. And remember, if you want to catch up on the campaign on the go, check out our Election Daily podcast, available wherever you get your podcasts. Hannah Mansing Tonight is next, right here on CBC News Network. I'll be hosting from Toronto for the rest of the week as we get ready for the big election on April 28th. See you tomorrow, gang.